have any technical issues, that you would please enter them into the chat box. Also, if you have any questions as it relates to the presentation or any information that is presented, please use the Q&A box to do so. And we will have time for questions later on in the presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to Tiffany.
Thank you very much, Bandy. And I am Tiffany Marley, the Project Director for the Learning Communities Resource Center. And welcome to today's webinar presentation, Two Generation Resources, to be facilitated by our partners, ICF International. Just very quickly, I could just share a little bit about the Learning Communities Resource Center itself. The Learning Communities Resource Center aims to build the network's capacity around fighting poverty, because it is poverty that rests at the center of who we are as a network. It's the heart of what we do and who we are. It is Jimmy Chapin who said that as a network, we must be focused on the right issues to address poverty. We have to be in tune with these issues, reflect on and create on strategies that have impact. And so as we think about this whole notion of a national webinar series, this series focuses on things related to the specific anti-poverty approaches and is a way for us to showcase these innovative approaches to the larger network. And as we think about innovative approaches, certainly two-generation approaches is one of those that it basically presupposes that the whole family's needs are being addressed in unison. So both the services and needs for children as well as the services and needs for their parents are addressed in an integrative fashion so as to maximize those outcomes for families who are needing to move out of poverty and even beyond stability to a thriving way of being. And so with that said, let's take a moment to pause and think a little bit about the promise that really grounds the work that we do on a daily basis in community action. And it is community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we're dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. So it is my pleasure today to introduce our two colleagues from ICF International, Courtney Berthel and Kristen Abner, who will provide us with a little information about themselves as well as what we can expect in today's webinar. Thank you, Courtney, and thank you, Kristen. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. Can you all hear me?
We can hear you just fine.
Great. I don't know if you can see me or not, but I'm going to start talking and let me know if y'all can't hear me or we need to, do something else. But we are excited to be here today to talk with you all about two-generation resources. Today we're going to provide an overview of the theory behind two-generation anti-poverty approaches, highlight the latest resources on two-gen programs, and then provide you with some tips for translating the research into effective practice. So I want to first introduce myself and Courtney, who will be presenting to you today. I'm Kristen Abner. I completed my PhD in 2014 in sociology. And my goal for my dissertation was to kind of build knowledge around the role of the neighborhood and social support, particularly in child welfare involvement, specifically thinking about child neglect. I've been working at ICF for the last 11 years, and mostly what I work on here are projects related to social programming for vulnerable families around TANF, child welfare, asset building, child care, transportation. I'm the project task lead for our Office of Family Assistance, OFA, Welfare Peer Technical Assistance Project, which I'll talk about a little later. And I'm the library and web task lead on the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse, which you will hear about multiple times throughout the presentation. I'm going to demo it at the end so you all can go and look at it and find resources yourselves. So a goal on each one of these projects is really to provide resources and technical assistance and disseminate the research out to practitioners like yourselves, policymakers, and researchers in the field. So a fun fact about myself, I have a 90-pound, 5-year-old Labradoodle who is best friends with my 2-year-old daughter and 5-month-old son. About halfway through the presentation, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, excuse me, Courtney Barthel. She has been working in this field for 15 years and has a master's in public affairs. Her work is around very similar, low-income and at-risk families and communities. She provides strategic guidance, subject matter expertise, technical assistance services, and research support on a variety of projects related to poverty alleviation. She has designed, delivered, and evaluated over 100 TA and training initiatives. So we're very lucky to have Courtney with us today. And Courtney's fun fact is very related to 2-gen approaches. She has 4 kids, and her in-laws just bought the house next door to her. So she really, and she put this in bold italics, really understands 2-generation models. And maybe Courtney will give you all some insight on that when it's her turn to go. So a roadmap on where we're going to go today. We're going to start with an overview and background of our relationship with CAP and the LCRC. Then we'll move into an overview of 2-gen approaches, how these came to be. I'll turn it over to Courtney, who will do an overview of the policy and programming of 2-gen approaches. And then we'll conclude with tips for translation and implementation. And we'll finish it up with additional resources where hopefully if we have time, I'll show you a little bit about the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse, like I said, where you can go and grab resources yourselves that are relevant to your work. So we're going to pause at the end of each section for you all to ask questions in your chat box, but we'll also save time at the end for questions. So, overview background. So, as you can see, this webinar is part of our 3-year partnership we've had with CAP, and we've been partnering with the CAP Learning Communities Resource Center for the past 3 years. So, we presented at CAP national meetings on the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse. Last year, we had the privilege to provide materials and present research to practice guidance to 3 of the LCRC cluster groups, so place-based, family homelessness, and financial capability. And we completed last year with a webinar on implementation science, and we'll give you some information on that at the end of the presentation. The materials are up on the CAP website for more information on that. So I'm glad to have those of you on the phone that have already heard my voice, and I want to welcome those of you who are joining us for the first time. Briefly, I want to talk a little bit about the kind of work we do here at ICF. If you didn't get it from our bios, we do work around family self-sufficiency, doing technical assistance and training for programs serving low-income families. We run a few online clearinghouses, as I mentioned, the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse, which is funded through the Administration for Children and Families Office of Family Assistance. Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. The second one is the Office of Family Assistance Welfare Peer Technical Assistance Network, as well as the National Resource Center for Healthy Marriage and Family. So the work that brought us together with CAP was the work with the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse, and you'll hear me say SSRC. It's a virtual portal of research, and what we do is we really try to curate resources that are around self-sufficiency and put them in a resource library, which I find is special because we have a team of folks that actually go in, they look at the research, they make sure that it is of sound quality, it's relevant to self-sufficiency, and what they do is they tag it by topic area, they tag it by research methodology. So it's really easy to go into our library and find things that you need because these resources are already reviewed by our team. And again, I'm going to demo this at the end. So today, our goal is to give you resources on two-generation approaches to poverty alleviation. So we're going to overview the current research and then give you some practice tips for implementing these approaches in your own work. So this slide shows our learning objectives, and the goal is to understand the state of the research and practice around two-gen approaches. And our second objective is to identify effective practices so that you can use it to improve your program. So this webinar will help you use best practices from other programs coupled with the research base to replicate for your context to better serve the families you work with. So your resource packet. It's grouped into 5 types of resources, and kind of what we do is we compile the literature, the really relevant literature on two-generation programming, and then this is kind of how it fell out into these 5 categories. I kind of like to call this a state of the field. So we have intergenerational poverty data, two-generation program benefits, program implementation and promising practices, and then we have examples of two-gen program types, and then we finish up with state policy information. So we provided links where some of these are already on the XSRC or the OFA Peer TA network. So if you click on one, you'll see that the XSRC provides the full abstract to the article, the research methodology, any relevant target populations, and topic area information, which will be all at your fingertips. Okay, so on to two-gen program models and kind of the history behind this approach. So as you all know from your work, there are a variety of challenges facing families today. So access to affordable, high-quality childcare with sufficient flexibility to support non-traditional changing work hours. So even when low-income families are able to access care, it's often not flexible, and many parents report quality concerns related to learning, development, or behavior more frequently than their high-income peers. So this trend in the literature carries through elementary education, where less than half of children from low-income families are ready for kindergarten, compared to 75% of those from moderate or high-income families. So the second one is acquiring or maintaining stable employment that pays a sufficient wage to support a family. And nearly 80% of families with children under the age of 8 are headed by parents who lack a higher education. So as you all know, in today's economic climate, not having a post-secondary degree really limits an individual's career opportunities. And this can translate to inflexible or low-paying jobs that don't support families and are not family supportive. If someone has to work different days of the week or late shifts, things like that. A high level of stress in the home due to poverty. So low-income families managing the challenges of financial insecurity, job uncertainty, and then coupled with that, juggling childcare, health issues, transportation barriers. So these all cause an elevated level of stress. And the last one is uncoordinated human service and community systems. So programs and services designed to support low-income families are often not integrated, as you all know. It's difficult to align programs together given funding requirements, data systems, and things like that. Programs are generally not designed around other families or their needs, which can leave parents in this difficult spot to choose between accessing services which target child development or those that can support their own employment and participation requirements. So compounding all these challenges, low-income families face to maintain healthy and self-sufficient homes. So the research shows that children born into poor families are more likely to experience poverty as adults and in turn raise their own children in poverty. So combining child-facing and adult-serving programs, this two-generation model, makes sense and may be an effective strategy to address some of these challenges and adverse experiences. So this is obviously our focus today. So this next slide, we have a video, and so I'm going to pass the ball over, and hopefully this video will show. Let me give you all a little introduction before we play the video. It's a short 5-minute video. It depicts a theory of change, and it's from the Frontiers of Innovation community for achieving breakthrough outcomes for vulnerable children and families. And it describes the need to focus on building the capabilities of caregivers and strengthening communities that together form the environment of relationships essential to children's lifelong learning, health, and behavior. So it really shows, I find that this video really shows the importance of investing in children and child outcomes to alleviate intergenerational poverty, and additionally strengthening the capacity of adults that are around children to be more effective parents and be employable to enhance this economic stability of the family. So I will pass it over to you all to play the video. Okay. So I still see the video. There we go. Perfect. I think I still hear the video. I do. I'm going to try to exit out. I think we're good. Okay. There we go. So I really like that video. I think it does a nice job of kind of showing how this all fits together. And I think it's a nice introduction to 2-gen approaches. So building off of the video, this slide shows some data around intergenerational poverty. So probably most of these statistics are not going to be surprising for any of you, but we did want to highlight them. 18% of children in the United States live in poverty, and that equates to about 13 million. African American children are more likely to be poor than white children, obviously, with racial disparities. Children who experience poverty are more likely to be poor as adults than their non-poor counterparts. Persistent poverty is associated with a much higher likelihood of poverty in adulthood again. Let's see, I missed something else I wanted to tell you all. So among adults who did experience poverty as children, about 20% were poor in young adulthood and 13 to 14% were poor in middle adulthood, respectively. So this really has a long-term effect into adulthood. And there is some literature, and you'll see it in the packet, that shows social programs like and the research is on Medicaid do promote intergenerational mobility out of poverty. So what does it mean to have a 2-gen approach? And this graphic is from the Aspen Institute's Ascend program, and this is their continuum, which I find, I feel like it's a really helpful tool to understand what fits under this 2-generation umbrella, and to think about how, why, and under what circumstances programs provide opportunities to improve the understanding of providing support to the whole family. So 2-generation programs, they're robust and they're multidisciplinary, drawing from theories around family resiliency, stress, investment theories, and really responding to the lack of intentionality from older models through really purposeful integrated programming and focusing on the human capital of the family as a whole. So while terms differ across these approaches, some programs refer to themselves as a whole family or dual generation. We really, when I say 2-gen, that's what we mean. The objectives are similar, focusing on helping low-income families become self-sufficient and supporting adults in their, in supporting both adults and children in learning, really. So really combining educational, occupational, and other services together to improve outcomes for adults and children. So one more thing on this continuum. So approaches that fall on this continuum may differ in key program elements or who they're really focused on, whether it's children or adults. They may differ across funding streams, partners, different program features, longevity, geography, or other factors. So why a 2-gen approach? So in 2013, 1 in 5 children under the age of 18 and nearly 1 in 4 under the age of 6 were living in families whose income fell below the federal poverty level. And, the video kind of alluded to this, but the detrimental effects of poverty on children and adults in these families reign across a multitude of developmental, physical, emotional, and cognitive domains. There's emerging research in the neuroscience and child development fields that documents the buildup of this negative experiences and consequences that these can have for kids on their physical and mental health and executive functioning. So 2-generation approaches address these challenges facing families, and they're really grounded in this holistic approach to meet child development and parental economic security so the family can effectively mitigate challenges, and this supports positive outcomes for all members of the family. So most research on two-generation approaches are around serving the custodial parents, but you'll also notice in your packet that there's been some evidence that bettering the lives of non-custodial fathers also helps support children as well. There's a lot in the child support literature around supporting non-custodial fathers, non-custodial parents in these approaches as well is beneficial. So the Foundation for Child Development conducted a report across 13 economic, education, and health indicators for children, comparing children whose mothers had not graduated high school, comparing those with higher levels of education. And pretty much across the board, mothers who have not graduated high school compared with those with a bachelor's degree, the statistics were really, not surprising, but pretty staggering. So 53% of children with mothers who had not graduated high school were living under the poverty level versus 4% for mothers with a bachelor's degree. The median family income was $25,000 versus $106,000. 48% versus 11% for the rate of not having a securely employed parent in the home, so not having a parent that works full-time year-round. And then looking also then at reading and math proficiency, separating children whose parents had not graduated high school, comparing those whose parents had a bachelor's degree, staggering across reading proficiency, math, and then also high school completion. Health disparities present around low birth weight, obesity, and being covered by health insurance, also very staggering statistics. So moving on to two-gen programming, Courtney will talk a little bit about this later, but I did want to introduce kind of why two-gen and why now. The roots of the two-generation anti-poverty approaches really can be traced back to settlement houses and then to the community empowerment movements in the 1960s and 1970s. Modern two-gen approaches are commonly understood to have begun in the 1980s or 1990s when providers of child development programs began incorporating adult-focused education and employment services into their programs. So at the same time, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, the precursor to TANF, began offering programming aimed at children in the family as well. These programs were really not well studied, but the information that we have on them really indicated that they lacked intentionality and really weren't widely adopted in the field. So this kind of new wave of two-gen programs in the last couple of years that have taken shape, they have been coined as two-gen 2.0 by two prominent social policy researchers in the field, Lindsay Chase Lansdale and Jean Brooks Gunn, who edited a Future of Children's Journal edition on two-gen approaches. It's also in your packet. So they describe this 2.0 model as they're distinct from earlier models because they're really deliberate in combining high-intensity service programs for children and parents, and they're intentional about services for both children and parents at the core. And they're mindful of opportunities to integrate services and support overall family wellness. So while current models of two-gen approaches really haven't been well studied because they're relatively new, they have drawn from the research around neuroscience, human capital, and child development. So I'm going to briefly talk through some of these theories that, on the next slide, that have really helped build two-gen approaches, and then we will move on to Courtney. So what is the research foundation of this approach, and what does the research say? So family stress and resiliency theories provide important framing on the principles of two-gen approaches relating to how the family unit functions and adapt in the face of adversity, and how to assess the whole family resiliency, both as a functional process and as an outcome stemming from increased family competency. So likewise, the neuroscientific research on child brain development and toxic stress, this also provides new insights about child and adult functioning that informs and helps shape the design and implementation of 2-gen approaches. So thinking about the video, the research suggests that when toxic stressors are present in early childhood without buffers, crucial executive functioning skills may not develop to their optimal potential. So the period really from ages 3 to 5 provides a vital opportunity for dramatic gains in executive skills. So this really enables us to plan, focus attention, and think about that really critical point of childhood as a point of intervention. And so understanding and translating this research to practice offers really important service implementation drivers for 2-gen approaches. And finally, parental support. So the research really points to the importance of parental support, direct services, and engagement of parents. So the single most powerful factor or buffer that can mitigate childhood stressors is a healthy relationship with a positive and stable caregiver. So stability, including economic and financial stability, has been linked to reducing toxic stressors in childhood. So the more recent 2-gen approaches are really built on these theories that are grounded in the research. So I'm going to go to the next slide, and this is an interactive part of the presentation before I pass it to Courtney. What are the challenges that you all face in implementing a 2-gen approach? If you could enter it in the chat box, and then Tiffany, I believe, will read them out so we kind of have an understanding of the challenges that you all are facing in your communities.
And so definitely use the Q&A box to put your responses in. So far, I don't see any responses. Okay, we're not seeing any. I'm not sure what is going on.
I actually have one, Tiffany.
Okay, thank you.
One challenge that I'm seeing is coordination of services and access and to get them involved. A second one we got in is challenges include working across agencies and collaborating with those who serve adults in poverty. Annual funding streams for multi-year approaches, and literacy issues within families. I also see another that says a major challenge is training as well as capacity of some of the agencies that we work with. Another we have here is coordinating services to be able to work together. Our funding streams are too specific. Another that just came in is finding specific funding streams that do not replicate services that are already being provided.
Thank you. So it sounds like to me a lot of, funding, the biggest thing here sounds like coordination. And coordinating with partners and coordinating funding streams and things like that. So I think that's not surprising. I think there are some resources in your packet around, toolkits for doing this approach that have how to coordinate. I think Courtney will touch on a little bit of that in her presentation. So I will pass it over to Courtney unless there are any lingering questions.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kristen. So Good afternoon, everyone. This is Courtney Barthel speaking, and I'm delighted to be with you for the second half of this conversation. I am going to make sure that I know how to change the slides, and there we go. Okay, so this part of the presentation is about 2Gen policy and programming, and I think at this point what I've heard Kristen really establish is the baseline for why 2Gen approaches are valuable for children and for adults, and really how they can support the ongoing success and health of communities. I think, though, that one of the things that we know from a history of working in this space is that it isn't always enough to have demonstrable effects of things that are good for children and families and communities. When you move into the policy context, you really need some data around return on investment, right? That's what legislators and policymakers want to see and hear. And so the exciting thing to me about the 2Gen model is that it does have these demonstrable effects for children and families and communities, but also does have some really exciting return on investment data as well. So that's going to be the focus of this section of the presentation. And this is another way of thinking about the 2Gen policy context. We have kiddos over here on the left side of the spectrum and parents over here on the right. And what you can see is as we're investing in children and in quality early education, we also are seeing resultant effects for parents and vice versa. So the nice thing about this whole family approach is that we can demonstrate that investment in high quality early ed leads to better child outcomes and that we get better outcomes for adults who in turn facilitate better outcomes for children. Said another way, investing in a solution that facilitates both of these outcomes magnifies the effect of both. So we get a sort of increasing at an increasing rate of return on the outcomes for families who are invested in with this strategy. And as a result of this kind of return on investment data and the ability to track $7 saved for every dollar of investment in early education, high quality early education, we're able to really show policymakers and legislators that this is something worth investing limited resources in. And I heard in your comments on the last poll the concerns about funding and the concerns about how you invest in something over the long term. I apologize, I don't have the names of everyone, but one of you commented about investing in a long-term program when you have an annual funding stream. And those are very significant challenges that require this type of data in order to be able to address. I think in part because of the availability of this type of data, we have been able to see a fairly supportive policy environment for 2Gen programs. So I know a lot of times over the course of decades of doing this type of work, we've come up with great solutions or things that we think are really valuable that haven't been carryable, that haven't been able to be grown in the environment that we were in. I think this is an opportunity of sort of fertile soil for these types of initiatives. There's an interest, so the Aspen Institute, who you've heard us mention a couple of times, is really one of the standard bearers for the 2Gen 2.0 movement. And they actually commissioned a poll to see exactly how popular these types of programs are. And even I was surprised at some of the data that they were able to uncover. Voters at both the federal and state level think that programs that target both parents and children would be the best way of solving some of these lingering challenges and helping families rise out of poverty. 63% of voters said that a 2-generation approach would be most effective, while 11% fell to the side of targeting just children and 4% to targeting just adults. What's really interesting is, and we know this from poll data and some of the things that we see, especially in election cycles, when you change the words a little bit, and you instead ask people whether or not they favor a program that is designed to help people who are living in poverty get out of poverty by targeting both parents and children, so that parents get education and skills and a better job while their children get off to a good start with early ed or Head Start. A full 81% of voters think that sounds like a really good idea, including 68% who strongly agree that would be the way to go. That, interestingly to me, when we talk about a bipartisan support for the program, a program like that sounds about right to 95% of Democrats, 79% of independents, and 65% of Republicans. So we do have a pretty solid base for this type of an approach, whether you use the words two generation, full family, dual generation, or any of the words that Kristen was talking about earlier when we looked at the continuum. Pollsters, being pollsters, didn't leave it there. They decided to dig a little bit deeper and ask those same respondents, would they still value a program, now defined as the program, would you still value the program if it increased your taxes? So your personal taxes go up. Do you still think the program is a good idea? Not surprisingly, the support weakens a little bit, but a majority of voters still think that program sounds like a way to go. And while certain tax-sensitive demographics do see a more significant decline, we still see a 70% response rate that voters are in favor of the program, and 52% still strongly favor the program. So even when your own personal tax burden is increased to pay for it, people still think it's a good idea. And these are the kinds of community fabric building elements of data that we can really use as a foundation for some of these programs. In the case of increased personal taxes, we see an 89% approval rate for Democrats and a 64% majority of independent voters. Perhaps, there's more tax-sensitive demographics, and in some of those we see a slightly higher erosion of the program support, with 53% of Republican men now opposing the program, and 51% of Republican women still approving of it. So it's an interesting study if you're a policy science wonk or a data geek. But the point is, there's some very strong public will for programs like this. And I think in that soil of bipartisan support, we have seen these pieces of authorizing and funding legislation pass in such places as Connecticut and Utah and Colorado. And I think one of the things that has happened as a result of these sort of leaders out in the field taking on the two-generation 2.0 model is we're starting to see data coming out of those programs, so actually particular program-specific data. And also we're starting to see really translatable, accessible graphics like this one. Ooh, I don't know how to make it come up. Come up. There it is. So this is from the Colorado Ascend 2-gen approach. And what's interesting about this to me is two things. What's interesting to me about how it can be of value to your programs and your efforts is two things. One, this is exactly the kind of data presentation that people love. So the sort of infographic style of presenting information. From this to that, everyone can follow it, everyone can see it. If you have, higher level training in data analysis or not, you can understand what this message is telling you. Perhaps even more importantly, though, is the modesty of this data. Between $1 and $499 of savings for college, and we're talking 3 times more likely to attend college and 4 times more likely to graduate. And these incredibly modest investments of financial resources, but one can extrapolate that those financial resources are born of a more community-wide, family-level commitment and demonstrated value of a college education. And then we see these incredible results. So I think that it all sounds great, right? So what are we going to do with this? How do we harness the power of this public will and really learn from these pioneers of what we're calling the 2-gen 2.0 model? I'm going to try and talk to you a little bit now about how we can extract those lessons and how you can take those lessons, couple them with the nuanced, rich understanding you have of your own home communities and provide a roadmap to some of this programming. All right, so how do we 2-gen? So this is my little 2-generation family here in the circle. I think they're so cute. They're not actually my family, but I think they're adorable, so I use them anyway. And when we talk about how to go about building these 2-gen programs, we see these 5 themes that emerge. And you all hit on most of them when you were talking about your challenges, right? The first one is about integration. And there's 3 really distinct parts of integration that are all very interrelated, if you will. And I want to start with the bottom one. This is something that we have heard about in the child welfare community for decades, and we still continue to hear about today, despite very many people's very best efforts to make it better, and that is the challenge of the multi-system involved family, who is being handed requirements for things that they have to do and steps they have to take and activities with which they have to comply that are diametrically opposed and cannot be accomplished at the same time. Further, we know from the neuroscience that families in some of these situations lack the executive function skill to manage these complex requirements. In the video, it was documented by the resources falling. Did you see them? The resources were falling. We were sending people all this great information, but they were in the house dealing with their crisis, and the information just fell, and no one could catch it. And that's what integration is talking about. We're talking about putting people in a situation where they can be successful and not creating multiple requirements that they can't meet. When you do that, you have to have systems and data that allow for that performance to occur. It's really about putting your money where your mouth is and allowing systems and data to be shared and integrated so that families can succeed in the environment that you create for them. Using the data to create a supportive legislative and policy agenda and articulate the type of funding that is required is step 2. Using that return on investment. Oh, I'm seeing a question. Sure, I can stop and answer a question. Let me look at this chat box. It says, how do you implement new programming to assist families when you are working with families in crisis? So I think that's an excellent question, and you've hit the asker of this question. The second clause of your question is the most critical part. You have to redress crisis first. Those families in that house where the information was falling down and they couldn't access it, those families cannot take new programming from you. They can't. They're, to use your word, they are in crisis. And the idea of instituting new programming for them right now is it's not possible. So what I would say to you in that situation is we have to deal with crisis management, but we also have to deal with crisis prevention. And the 2-gen model is about stopping that cycle of repetitive crisis by building executive function skills, by building a smart pathway that supports kiddos, that supports parents, that equips parents to support kiddos so that the triggers like childcare, like transportation, don't set families into a new spiral. So we, folks who have executive function skills, are not sent into a crisis by your typical things that upset your day. Everyone has Mondays, right? We all have those days where we just want to crawl back into bed and not do this anymore. But because we, especially, you know, if you have big families or your in-laws buy the house next door, that is a true story. Those things upset your day and make you wonder what exactly you're going to do next. But they don't send you into a crisis. You are now not able to go to work the next day. You don't yell at your boss or, you know, take too long of a break or have an argument with a coworker. That is what 2Gen is all about, is about developing those skills so that we can head off the crises before they happen. And I'm seeing the note that you can ask the questions whenever you want. Hyacinth, whatever works for your folks. Okay, so that was sort of a little bit of a side step from our 5 steps here. Partnerships is the next piece, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more as we go forward. We are not suggesting to you that you become an early education provider and a workforce development provider and a crisis management provider and a DV counselor and a substance abuse and a mental health. Like, no one can do that. No one can do that well. I think the community action model is beautiful, and you all have an incredible history of impact in your communities. The best way to do that is by knitting together a fabric of community providers that do that work. What's important about that is we have to include the school system and the workforce system, who are not always the first folks that we think of when we're making our social service quilt, right? We are good at talking to our information and referral partners. We are good at talking to the other human services people. We're good at talking to the social services people and the child welfare people, because all of those people talk about the same thing we're talking about. But those school people and those workforce people talk about different things, and we don't know what those people are talking about. Those aren't our people. In the 2-gen model, those are your people, and they have to be your people in order for the system and the continuum to work. Just kind of keep in mind who our people are going to be. We're going to talk more about this as well. This fourth step is labeled families, and it probably should be the first step. We're talking about a family, a whole family solution, right? Both generations, the whole household, the whole family. But it isn't just about developing a program, integrating services, creating support and legislative funding that addresses the challenges that that family has. It's about asking that family what their challenges are. It's about developing the personal agency of the leaders of that family to direct their family's experience through the program. It is quite literally about giving ownership of your program over to the families that it's going to serve. And it's important for 2 reasons. One, because there will always be things we don't know. The most connected community advocate who has lived and breathed with the families that he or she serves for decades still doesn't know everything they need to know. The other is that the process of developing executive function skills is an immersion process. And in order for folks to have an immersion experience, they have to be doing executive function skills. And what better way to give them a chance to do executive function than to make them the executive of their own experience? Put them in charge of their experience in a supported, safe space, help them course correct, help them figure out where they're going, and then let them get themselves there. And the person that comes out the other end will be so much better for the experience that you allowed them to have, right? It's not paternalistic, it's empowering. So let them be the executive of their own experience. And then lastly, evidence. So we're going to encourage you in this effort to learn from those who have gone before you. And we're also going to encourage you to contribute to the knowledge base for those who will come after. So be thoughtful about your own program evaluation. Be ready to measure your success. Be ready to document your failures, right? All of that is part of being part of the larger community of 2-gen operators and building on the knowledge base that we can all use to make our programs better going forward. All right, so that's a little bit about how do we 2-gen. There's a lot of words on that slide, so the next slide is for my visual learners. So those were for my words. Here's some pictures for people who prefer the picture model. Okay, so what's on this slide? What are we talking about? We're bringing our 2-gen programs to life. How do we do that? The first image on this slide, and the most important one, is the one right in the middle. That's our family. Our family who's at the center of the approach, who's directing their own experience, who's casting their own objectives and figuring out their own success metrics. That is the executive of our model, right? Immediately above the family, not because they need to be above, but because it's a circle, is the school. And the image is intended to represent all childhood education, from early ed through elementary, junior high, and high school. The selection of the traditional school building, though, is intentional. And its intent is really to illustrate how important it is that your early education experiences be to the school system, right? Kristen gave you some stats earlier about school readiness and kindergarten readiness, that the social and developmental and educational elements of kindergarten readiness have to be foundational in a high quality early education experience. Doesn't mean worksheets that I have 2 preschoolers myself right now. I don't want them doing worksheets in school. But I do know that the program they attend in the mornings is helping them be ready to attend kindergarten and to launch tradition in a healthy, smart, robust way. The home with the little heart on it represents the strategy that is growing in popularity in the 2Gen movement to use housing as a platform, especially really mixed income housing and public housing, as a point of access to families. So one of the questions that came up in the challenges was around, how do we get to families? Where are these families? How do we find them? How do we work with them? There's an interesting model right now being run out of the Urban Institute, which is called HOST. And there's some interesting lessons learned, including some really tough lessons about integration and what integration really looks like, and how far people had to move from where they started with their thought about what integration looks like to serve these families in a holistic way. And there are other programs which, you know, Kristen, you talked about the SSRC, and that's a project that we run for ICF. We've had great success in beginning with housing, for lack of a better term, right? And I guess it's kind of literally meeting people where they live. It's about using the housing experience as a point of access to families, and it has real promise in the 2Gen world. So I encourage you to be thoughtful about that as an opportunity. The image at the bottom is the workforce training model. You know, 2Gen models support adult family members through education and training and workforce readiness. Historically, we've called that soft skills, right? We got to work on soft skills. We got to work on time management and conflict resolution and appropriate workforce behaviors. But we understand now from our neuroscience friends that it's really an executive function task. It's about benefiting from the skill building beyond employment readiness, because those same skills drive effective parenting and family wellness, right? That's all one suite of skills, if you will. And then this image all the way on the left of the screen, it's an image courtesy of 0 to 3 because I couldn't do it as well as they did, is a home visiting model. And while certainly not all 2Gen programs do home visiting, it is a core element of some of them, some of the more well-known, like the New Haven Moms model and things like that. What I like about the notion of home visiting is that it's really an extension of the notion of personal agency to kind of a community agency, right? Members of the community are supporting one another. They're invaluable. They have that deeply nuanced understanding of the community and the challenges that folks are facing. This is about, you know, building skills for both parent and child simultaneously, and developing a relationship that lets folks develop their childhood milestones, to really reach their childhood milestones, as well as, you know, helping to manage the personal financial health and well-being of families. We know that gives kiddos the foundation that they need to be successful. Okay, so a couple of examples. If you wanted to start learning today about how you could model your programs, this is the part where I slow down and catch my breath and you look at the words on the screen. You're going to have a copy of this, so if you're furiously writing down the names of these, you can save yourself a hand cramp and know that this is coming to you. And the idea here for the remainder of my portion is to give you a framework for how you can use the smarts of these folks to make your programs work, because it's not as simple as reading what they did and then doing it yourself. Okay, so tips for translation. Those programs are the first thing that most people think of is to go and look at the program, but that's actually the last step in the process that I'm going to suggest to you today. The framework begins with what we're doing right here, right now together, which is establishing this baseline understanding. Then you walk through the development of your plan, your own theory of change, and then you'll be ready to ask the key questions of those programs for how to learn from what they've done. All right, tip 1, find and use research to inform your plan. All right, so you are reading a study from the beautiful packet that Kristen and her team put together for you, and you're investing time in that review so that you can apply the lessons learned to your own effort, right? But how do you do that? How do you make sure that what you're taking away from the report that you're reading in the SSRC library is of value to you? And the first step is to understand the data. What do you know about the methods? Can you trust it? Well, the good news is if you're reading it in the SSRC library, you absolutely can trust it because someone's already done that work for you. It's already been reviewed for quality methods and appropriate messages. If you find research somewhere else, just make sure you do a quick review and a sanity check about what it's telling you. So if you make decisions based on the findings, you know they're reliable. Second, what are the constraints of the study that you're reading about? How does that program work? Where is it set? You know, what population is it serving? Is it applicable to me? You know, a simple example would be a study of a 5,000 person inmate population in Alabama. And can I apply that to a low-income community in Boston? I don't know. You have to think about it. You have to look at the methods and see what makes sense and look at the constraints. And then thirdly, and most importantly, extract the message. What is this saying to me? And that is all about defining your why. Kristen had a why slide way back at the very beginning, and you're going to get very tired of hearing me say why before the end of my talk here in a few minutes. But what I mean by that is the importance of why. And if you are a TED Talk fan, after this, go and run a Google search for Simon Sinek and his importance of why. It's fascinating. And he talks about it from a marketing standpoint, but from a program development standpoint, it's just as valid. And he says, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And I love it. Everyone has heard me talk before, has heard me quote Simon, because I think it's brilliant. And it's important at this stage because it's tempting to just take all this data and toss it into a stew and stir it up and then pour it back out onto your own community. But program replication is fraught if your objective in serving your community is different than the objective of the people who initiated the program that you're replicating. So we want to make sure that we don't just pick up someone else's 2-gen approach and drop it in over here because they may not be attempting to rectify the same situation. They may not be serving the same community. So the first thing you have to do is figure out why. Oh, and it's not because the community foundation in your community is really excited about paying for 2-gen approaches right now, right? That's not our why. So we're going to be thoughtful about what we're really trying to do here. So you know why you want to do 2-gen. And I get it, funding is important, and if you've got funders in your community who are really hot to trot about 2-gen, that can be really tempting. I'm not saying you don't pursue that, but we want to take a step back from there and talk about how we can all walk in the same direction, and that's why we use our logic model. Many of you are probably very familiar with logic models. Please go. So if you're an expert, you can take a little quick mental break because I'm going to talk about recipes. My team will tell you that, oh, thank you for the Simon Sinek link. My team will tell you that if you listen to me long enough, you will hear some kind of random metaphor for some kind of complex information. And so tonight it's going to be about recipes. And today, is going to be about that awful moment when you or your partner or your kids are sitting in the living room and somebody says, "What's for dinner?" Right? You know, that horrible, awful moment that we're all dreading in a couple of hours if you're on the East Coast. Or maybe somebody's shouting it, maybe somebody's sulking about it. But that question, the ingredients for the meal that you're eventually going to cook, those are the inputs in your logic model, okay? The activities column are the instructions and the recipes that tell you what to do with those ingredients. Stuff like preheat the oven to 350, bake for 12 to 14 minutes. And the outputs is what comes out of the oven when you're done, the product that you have at the end of cooking. But what if the casserole that you just took out of the oven after 14 minutes just sat on the counter? Are you really done? No, you're not done, right? Because you weren't in the business of making a casserole. You're in the business of making change. And if you cook a casserole and sit it on the counter, the kids are still yelling across the living room because they still haven't gotten what they needed. They didn't need you to bake them a casserole. They needed something else. So the last columns in your logic model measure the change that you created. You know, perhaps proximally the kids stop yelling. That would be a nice outcome, wouldn't it? Intermediately, they're nourished and happy. And distally, they thrive in school and activities because they're consistently well-nourished. So this is why I talk about why all the time. Your why was not to make casserole. Your why is a healthy, well-nourished, thriving child or children. And when you know that, and when everyone in your organization is walking towards that same goal, all of the choices are clearer, the activities are more well understood, and everyone makes the same type of choices when faced with limited resources. Right? If you and the partner, other adults, or whomever else in your home is helping you make decisions, are both invested in well-nourished, happy, healthy children, you're going to make the same choices about what goes in the casserole instead of one of you calling for pizza because it's been a really long day. That's the value of the logic model. Tack it to the wall. It's the roadmap that gets you where you're going. Right. So tip 3, study the successful approaches. So now we've extracted our key messages, we've articulated our why, we've got a roadmap hanging on the wall, and it's time now to go back and look at those other programs. Because we're not using their recipes, but we might use their ingredients or their really cool cooking techniques that would speak to our community. When you're doing that, I know you're tired of me saying start with why, so I'll skip over it. Start with why. Listen to the families. Put them on your advisory board. Put them in control of their experience. Learn from what they have to tell you. It's hard. They're busy. They're stressed. They're in crisis. Meet them where they are. Feed them. That always helps. Listen to your families. Be intentional about your journey. Make choices that move you along the continuum you have articulated. Resist the urge to stop making casserole and start making crepes. Sometimes casserole is hard, but if you're on a journey that includes casserole, stay on the casserole journey, stay the course, okay? Foster innovation, but stand on the shoulders of those giants who have gone before you. Learn from their experiences, take their lessons learned, filter them through your own community lens, and innovate for families in your own hometowns. Obviously, we're going to consider dual outcomes. What that means is that when you look at that continuum, the second step in from either end was talking about child-focused outcomes with parental pieces, for lack of a better term, and parental-focused outcomes with child pieces. It doesn't have to be this is what we do for kids and this is what we do for adults, and they're different and disparate and apart from each other. You can create programming that integrates both outcomes together. When you're doing that, you've got to align those systems. You have to think about the barriers that the systems in place are creating for families and the way that they are standing between you and the outcomes that you're looking for. And this one I think is so important and so hard to do, to consider structural inequality in your approach. You need community advisors to help you do this because our blind spots are invisible to us. We don't know they're there. So invite people to the table, be vulnerable, allow people to tell you what you don't know so that your programs can reflect what your community actually needs. And then lastly, cultivate partnerships for the families you serve. I talked about this a little bit earlier. You don't need to do everything at once. You need to be the glue that holds your community providers together. So invite people into that conversation and create those partnerships. Okay, I am going to hand this back to Kristen, but I think before I do, there's a question. Let me see if I can read it. How is the 2Gen approach partnering with community-based initiatives like Circles USA and also Bridges Out of Poverty? So we talked a little bit about Bridges Out of Poverty in our last event, or perhaps it's coming up in the next one. I think that Bridges Out of Poverty is a good example of, so I want to back up from the question just a little bit. The 2-generation model doesn't sort of have a presence on its own. It's just a way of going about business, right? So you see its fundamental premises in most of the programs that you're talking about. The nice thing about it not having a presence is it is allowed to be malleable and flexible and tailored to the communities that it's serving. So I would say just about any of the promising programs you're looking at these days have elements of the 2-gen model in them. And that's the task, that's the work ahead of you, is to look at those programs and extract out the pieces of them that make sense to serve your community. So Kristen, those are the end of my slides. Before I hand it back to you, I'm going to ask a question of Hyacinth and Tiffany. Do you want us to answer any questions now, or do you want to wait till after Kristen goes through her resources?
I think we'll proceed with Kristen and see where we are at that point.
Okay, Kristen, back to you.
Great. I think you have to pass me the ball, Courtney. Here we go. Thank you. So for additional resources, we have mentioned this a few times, but we did want to give you a overview of the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse. As you all are aware, there are dozens of online data sources that can be useful to you in your work. The SSRC compiles relevant resources in a one-stop location, so we really do a lot of work around the SSRC library. So if you click on the tab when you're on the SSRC, the search library button, you will go to the library. And now that I'm looking at these slides, you know, we don't have the SSRC link on the slides. So we will put that in the chat box, but it's opressrc.org. And we will make sure that gets to you all so you can go and kind of poke around the SSRC. The SSRC is ever growing. We add 40 resources a week into our library that we review, and like Courtney said, we make sure that they're of sound research quality, and we provide additional information about each resource we put up, so the target population, topic areas. We drill down to pretty specific around what the article is about. So it really has a lot of tools and information to help you design evidence-driven programming, and has a lot of resources that can help you when you're thinking about what outcomes to measure and how to measure them. So the SSRC, like I said, it's federally funded by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Administration for Children and Families Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. ICF is the leader on running the SSRC, but we also work with Child Trends, the Urban Institute, and the FAME Group. We have a group of leading folks in the field on self-sufficiency, a technical working group that really helps drive things that we put up on the SSRC. The site was really developed with practitioners, policymakers, and researchers all in mind. So there's lots of different features on the site to help you and support you in your work. So the clearinghouse is organized around 12 topic areas, which were developed from a lot of focus groups in the field, talking to people on what really needs to be included when we're talking about self-sufficiency. So these topics, you can search the library by clicking on one of these topics, or you can also, no, you know what, I'm going to say this on the next slide, so I will save that. The key here to note is that the SSRC only includes resources if the materials focus on improving the self-sufficiency of low-income populations. So you're not going to find things, you know, if you type something into Google, you got to weed through it to make sure, find things that are relevant. These are already curated and reviewed, and so anything in there is going to be relevant to the work that you do. So I wanted to say that. We have a lot of information on using data on the website. There are data sets you can pull, resources on understanding methodology. Okay, I pulled this resource and they did a randomized control trial. What exactly does that mean? We host a lot of webinars on self-sufficiency topics. So be sure to sign up for our listserv, and you will get notifications on upcoming virtual events that we host. There we go. So I started to say this and then I stopped. So how can you use the SSRC? So Like I said, all of the resources in our library, we have over 5,000 resources. They're already reviewed by our team. And our library is really cool because we have two kinds of search features. We have a keyword search, so you can type in 2 generations into the keyword search. Or you can do what we like to call a faceted search, where on the left-hand side of the library, if you go to the website, you'll see that you can click on different topic areas and different research methodologies or different target populations and come up with a list of research. So if you're interested in research on toxic stress among rural families, you can click through on the side and research may or may not actually show up with that. I don't know if there's been research on rural families and toxic stress, but it may. So you can also kind of play around with that feature, which can help you find things rather than just kind of typing a keyword into the box. We have topical pages where you can browse research. These are updated regularly. We also have on those topical pages what we like to call SSRC selections, which are reading lists of recommended resources around given topics. We just put one up on employment and disability. We have a variety of these up there under our Browse Topics pages. So I'd suggest going there and poking around if you're interested in seeing kind of what we have out there on our 12 topic areas and more specifically on subtopics related to those. We have events that we don't just have SSRC events on our calendar. We have really any event related to self-sufficiency and poverty. So I'd encourage you to look at the calendar. And like I said, if you're unfamiliar with kind of research and research terminology, we have a lot of products and data sets around understanding research terms and methodologies and data sets that can potentially be used for looking at data across the country. So to wrap up, we mentioned this, our webinar we did last year on implementation science. So if you're interested in, okay, how do I use this information to really implement a 2-gen program, I'd really encourage you to go to the webinar and listen and review the slides. Courtney was kind of spoke about some of this, logic modeling, using data, using research. We presented last year really diving into how to do this. So I wanted to put this up here so you all would have it handy. And I believe that Tiffany will be mentioning this, but we are presenting 2 more webinars, one in May and one in June on trauma-informed approaches and bundling services. So I hope to see, quote unquote, many of you all there, and I want to thank you for your participation. So I will turn it over to Tiffany at this point.
Thank you very much, Courtney and Kristen. A very insightful, helpful grounding in this whole notion of 2-generation approaches. And what I would say is that the Community Action Partnership is uniquely positioned to do this work, as already has been said, and so it's something that we will continue to place on the radar for the network for us to think about in a meaningful way so that we can address the needs of the whole family more effectively as to increase or improve outcomes for families who are striving to move out of poverty. With that said, my colleague Hyacinth has a question from the field.
Yes, we got a question in for you ladies. The question is, how do you run 2-gen programs where there are many families where both parents do not live with the child?
So that's a great question. So this is Courtney. I think there's a couple things that I would say to that. I think it's going to be specific to the community that you're working with. I think it will also be specific to reasons why the parents aren't living with the child. And I also think it would depend, sorry, there's more questions than answers, but It would also depend on the target of the intervention. So there's no rule that says the 2 generations have to be sequential. There's no rule that says the adult generation can't be, let's say, the grandparents who are caring for the child and the child, him or herself. I think if your objective is to reach the biological parents and the child, and perhaps on a journey to reunification or family stabilization in that respect, you're going to run the same type of program only with the lens of meeting the needs of both the child and the adult at the same time. So if you have, multiple barriers like incarceration, or if there's a history of trauma there, you're going to still have to do those healing kind of activities and those executive function kind of building, like we saw in the video, where you're still going to have to teach people how to do the basics so then they can become ready to receive the more advanced intervention. I would say there's lots of options available to you depending on the specifics of the circumstance.
All righty, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? We're not seeing any more at this time in the Q&A window, but that is our segue to wrap things up. Once again, we want to thank our colleagues from ICF for sharing with us, and as we prepare to close today, want to raise a couple of announcements. One, there are more 2Gen resources available. Want to mention Making Tomorrow Better Together, which is a resource that has been put out by Aspen Ascend. Additionally, we recently hosted a 2Gen presentation facilitated by Garrett County Community Action Committee and CAPS-TULSA, and both of those are agencies, community action agencies, that are actively engaged with the 2-generation approach. So the recording to their presentation, as well as the slides and the accompanying practice brief, Uplifting the Family, a 2-generation approach, is now available online as the Learning Communities Resource Center landing page on the partnership website. It's also available on the slides that you see here. We would also like to invite everyone to our next national webinar presentation scheduled for tomorrow. So tomorrow, same time, same station. Feel free to register. It's not too late to register for tomorrow's presentation, Tools and Strategies for Helping Clients Build Financial Capability, to be facilitated by CFED. And we are also featuring this in the presentation facilitated last week in support of April being Financial Capability Month. Additionally, we have a presentation on trauma-informed approaches, a guide to the resources that Courtney has already mentioned that they will be highlighting, which dovetails very nicely with what we have talked about regarding 2-generation approaches. And they will conclude their series, ICF series, with their Bundling Services webinar for June the 7th. So if you haven't registered already, please do so. Once again, we thank everybody for taking the time out to learn a little bit more, for taking the time out to obtain a few more skills or insights to help you fight poverty more effectively, because from our perspective, that's where the rubber meets the road. It's about moving families out of poverty, and we thank you all for everything that you do on a daily basis to be in touch with families and to be in touch with communities so that they might be helped and so that their lives might be changed. So we thank you all again, and thank you again, Kristen and Courtney. This concludes our webinar today. Everybody make it a great day. Don't forget to come out to San Antonio in August for our annual convention as well, where Courtney will be with us from ICF to present as well. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.